Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I was drafted in 1965.
Where were you living at this time?
I was living with my mother, actually, at the time. And I was going to school and working part-time for the state of Connecticut in a laboratory, medical laboratory.
Can you recall your first days in the service?
Absolutely. Actually, it started with me coming home after work and my mother handing me a letter from the saying that I have to go for a physical in New Haven, Connecticut. Get on the train in Hartford, downtown Hartford, take the train in New Haven, and bus would pick you up and bring you over to the recruiting station to take a physical. So we all thought we were on the bus and the train going to New Haven to take a physical. That's what we all had planned for. And so we get through and we take our physical, and you know, they line us all up and everything like that. And as soon as the physical was over, we waited in a room for a little while, and then they called out a few names, and then they said, the rest of you come into the other room. And as soon as we went into the other room, they said, put your right hand up. And we had to swear in an oath. And they said, congratulations, you're now in the military. And they said, if you need to make a phone call, there's phones out in the hallway. Call your home or your parents or loved ones or whatever, and let them know that you're going to Fort Dix tonight. So we probably got on the bus, I don't know, sometime that evening. They gave us lunch. I remember it was a small little, like a box lunch or something, and then we loaded on a bus and we left for Fort Dix. We didn't get to Fort Dix until probably 2 o'clock in the morning. We were all tired, and you know, from the physical, and plus traveling on the bus for so long, just waiting around. And drove into a completely empty parking lot, huge parking lot, and waited there until a sergeant came in a Jeep and started yelling at us and get us all off the bus. And they brought us to for haircuts and get your underwear and your fatigues, boots, and everything like that. And everything was rush, and put everything else in a fatigue bag, and then rushed us off to where our barracks were going to be.
Now, is this your boot camp, or?
This is boot camp. Yeah, this is right from the physical, right
You did it at Fort Dix.
at Fort Dix. Yeah, Fort Dix, New Jersey.
Can you
Yeah.
remember any experience during that time?
Yeah, I mean, it was, you know, typical United States Army recruit camp, you know. A lot of yelling, you know. I remember that the barracks that we were in, they had, I guess, that previously been in wooden barracks, the old wooden barracks. So now we were in this, like, brick barracks, and they were fairly nice quarters, like 4-man to a room. And I remember walking in, and I noticed that the hallway, the tile on the hallway was was shiny like glass, you know. And I always wondered why. Well, and I figured that out really quick. We cleaned the hallway every day, polished it and buffed it down. But you were never allowed to walk in the middle of the hallway. You always had to walk on the ends, in your socks. You couldn't walk with your boots in the hallway either. Because the other guys, the regular GIs, you know, your regular recruits, they yell at you too, you know. But we certainly started learning military ways very quickly. I had a sergeant. His name was Sergeant Bell, Al Bell. He was a, you know, tough old soldier from Second World War in Korea, and you know, he was finishing out the end of his career, and he was a recruit instructor, and he didn't mix any words when he talked to you.
Thinking about that hall, how did you take care of that hall? There were hands and knees in your towel?
Oh, yeah, no, we, you know, buffed it. It was mopping and buffing, you know, the same thing with the bathrooms and toilets and everything like that. And, you know, they would come in and inspect, you know, that was the thing. They would come in and do an inspection. And I mean, if they found any dust anywhere or anything like that, you'd have to do the whole thing all over again, you know. And just kept going over things over and over again, your locker and your closet and everything like that, to make sure everything was folded completely right and square away your bed. Your bed had to be squared away, right to the T, and your shoes lined up, and no shoelaces hanging out or anything like that. And you paid the penalty if you didn't do it.
What was the penalty?
Well, you had extra push-ups. You have to go cut the grass with a butter knife, on your hands and knees, and push-ups, pull-ups on the bar. They had a bar outside the door where you did pull-ups before you walked into the chow hall. Little extra duties like that.
Did you do anything special or get any special awards or anything like that during basic training?
They didn't have anything like that. They had maybe a leadership one. They'd pick maybe one guy out that was either the top recruit and maybe honored him in a certain way. But there wasn't a whole lot of awards. It was a lot of work. We were constantly trained, and they were constantly telling us that we were going to go to Vietnam. At that point, if you don't do what I say, you're gonna end up dead in Vietnam because you didn't pay attention.
Wow. Was there any special training after big camp?
Yep, I had a lot of special training actually. When you go through basic training, they give you a whole battery of tests. Aptitude tests to go through, and I had worked in a little bit at that time in the medical field. So my MOS came out to be 92B20. Well, 92B20 is a medical laboratory technologist. So they said to me at the end of training, you have some ability for medical. Would you be interested in going into the as a medic? And I said, absolutely, sure. So they sent me off to specialized training in Fort Lee, Virginia. And there were 4 of us. We all rendezvoused there at Fort Lee, after basic training, and went right into a medical lab where we worked side by side with some civilians and other military personnel in a hospital called Kenner Army Hospital, which was in Fort Lee, Virginia. And we worked, it was a like on-the-job type training, plus, we worked every day, like 7 days a week. Finally, after getting through learning hematology, blood bank, chemistry, and everything like that, and dealing with patients every day, the 4 of us got sent to Walter Reed Army Hospital for special training in studying malaria. So we were in Virginia, and after a while, Walter Reed Army Hospital, it didn't take us long to figure out why we were there. And one of the guys said, look, if you look through the manual and figure out all the places in the world that have malaria, you'll soon find out that one of the biggest populations of malaria is Southeast Asia. Africa, nothing happening in Africa right at the moment, but so it looks like, we're going through this. And I tell you, to this day, I can still look at a blood smear and tell you what type of malaria you have. We just looked at slides after slides after slides for maybe a week and a half, every day. Hundreds and hundreds of different blood smears, so that we could identify them as quickly as we could. Soon after that, we got sent back to Virginia, and we weren't back a week, and 4 envelopes came, and the captain called us into the office and said, here's orders, and you're going to go on R&R, not R&R, you're going on leave for about a week. Go home, your families or whatever like that, and then after that you're going to report to Oakland, California. So we all went home. We met up again in Oakland, and we got there a couple of days early, and I looked around San Francisco and stuff like that. I'd never seen San Francisco before, which I thought was going to be warm, and I think it was June, and it was rather cold almost every day. It was like 50 degrees, and it wasn't as warm as I thought California was going to be. We got on. They told us what day we were leaving. When we got there, of course we had to have another physical, and everybody had. Well, once what they did is they had to give, I'd say there was probably 200 of us, and you had to have shots to go overseas. Well, when you go through a whole battery of shots, you had to hold your arms like this. And they went through with these air guns, and they gave you the shots. Well, I'll tell you, out of 200 guys, I bet 180 of us were sick as a dog with fever and everybody for the next day. It didn't take long, but it was probably a day or two before you started to feel yourself again, because you had so many different shots, probably 4 on each side. And, you know, it just felt lousy for the next day. After that, we got on a commercial airline, like a TWA or something like that, in our Army tan short sleeve uniform, you know, the khaki pants and short sleeve shirt, duffel bag, you know, standard duffel bag, put that on the plane, no weapons at all. And when we get on the plane, some of us were in conversation with other guys, and there was this young guy, and I was only probably 20 at the time, and this young kid, he probably was about 18, and his name was Bossy, which was funny. He was a blonde kid, kind of meek little kid, and other guys would tease him, you know, about going to Vietnam and this and that. And they told us on a plane, once the plane lands for refueling, you can stay in the airport, but you can't leave the airport, then get right back on the plane again. So the route was that we fly from California to Hawaii, from Hawaii to Okinawa, from Okinawa to the Philippines, from the Philippines to Vietnam. Well, they were talking to this kid on the plane. I could see that he was rather nervous. By the time we got to Hawaii, we got off the plane, he never got back on the plane again. Never saw him, nobody ever saw him. They called his name out quite a few times. Plane was refueled and we left. So whatever happened to him, I really don't know. Got to the last station, which was the Philippines for refuel. And then we started to approach Vietnam. And I could remember the plane coming into Tan Son Nhut Airport. And it broke through the clouds, and the plane started like it was coming down. Then he took back left and went up again and started circling the airport. And as the plane dipped, the sergeant said to me, "It looks like we're going to land this time, but there's some tanks crossing the runway." And he's probably waiting for those tanks to clear so he could land. So anyway, so the plane came in and it landed, and when it landed, they got on the overhead speakers, and they said that when you get off the plane, you're going to walk quickly directly right over to a hangar, a big hangar area for the plane. But I remember when the plane landed and they opened the door, I could feel the heat, the outside heat, because we've been on an air-conditioned plane for a long time. I could feel the heat coming in. And that was the first feeling that I got from Vietnam. Then we walked into a hangar, and they came over with unloaded the plane with all the duffel bags on it, and threw them on the floor. We each got our duffel bag. Then they pulled up with Army school buses. Well, the Army school bus that we got on had a infantryman with an M16 at the door, and then we all got on in our khakis, short sleeve shirts, and we sat down, and the very first thing I noticed that all the windows on the bus were covered with chicken wire. It was not an air-conditioned bus, just a regular Army school bus. So the sergeant, the older guy, I said to him, I said, "What's the story with the chicken wire all over the windows?" And he said, "Well, we're going to go drive through Saigon." And he says, as we drive through Saigon, he says, there's a lot of kids on motorcycles, the little motor scooters and stuff like that. He says, sometimes, he said, they take a grenade and they throw it in the bus. He said, this just prevents the grenade from bouncing in off the window so it doesn't go inside the bus. I said, oh, boy, well, welcome to Vietnam. But I don't know if you've ever traveled in a third world country, but the sights and smells are different than the United States. They do a lot of outside cooking. There's open sewage system and stuff like that. So Vietnam has a smell of its own. We got there, and they brought us to an internment camp, you know, not an internment camp, but a camp where you get your duty station. And it took them about 3-4 days till we figured out where we were going. And my outfit, I was assigned to what they was called the 85th Evacuation Hospital. And it was about 150 miles north of Saigon in a place called Quy Nhon. That was my first introduction to a C-130 plane, which is called the Goonie Bird. And when we looked at it from the ground, and we looked at it, me and the other 3 buddies of mine that were going to the same place, it looked like it would be able to take off. It was a big, wide-body plane with very small little wings. But soon found out it was a great great airplane. And the funny thing about it is a big, wide body. It had all rollers on the floor, and way off to the side there was little webbing, nylon webbing. That was your seats on the side. So we all got in there and sat down, and they put some supplies, I guess, in the middle. But we were able to, you know, yell at one another. The plane was very loud. Yell at one another and talk to each other. But I remember the plane had to fly in between 2 mountain ranges to get down to the coastline where the hospital was, and the hospital wasn't far from the airport. We got there, and you know, finally got fatigues on and boots and, you know, our stuff, and I found that our home was a tent with about 8 to 10 foot sides of sandbags all the way around this tent, and the floor was metal tracking, the tanks use, I guess, you know, and that was the floor. And we had a little Vietnamese woman that came in, a mama san, and shine your boots for you and clean up, you know. And so we had to get some of the essential things like a mat in front of your bunk and stuff like that. And in a day or two we went down into town and we bought a mat for front of our bunk and brought it back. And a little Vietnamese woman, whatever little English she could speak, she asked us how much we paid for it, and we said $5. She rolled up all the mats, right? She got mad at us. She hit one guy with the mat, and she took all the mats and went into town and came back and gave us all new mats and gave us all back a couple of bucks. So we paid too much, so we gave her the rest of the money.
Can you remember her name?
No, I can't remember her name now.
Now, you talked about your guys. Were the 4 of you all was together?
No, we were there for a while together, and then a couple of guys got shipped out to other places.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you remember their names?
Was Bob Del Oliver, Richie Costa, and I can't think of the other guy's name right now. But we haven't seen each other in 40 years, I guess, or something like that. But the job was working in the lab, and I don't know if, you know, back then, medical laboratory technologists, when you worked in a lab, we handled everything from the battlefield to even simple accidents that would happen. People driving deuce and a halves to Jeeps, driving too fast, they flip over. There could be accidents. There's a lot of mud in Vietnam during the monsoon season. Guys getting their hands caught in machinery at the airport and stuff like that. And so we handled not only the battlefield wounded, but accidents that happened. The first thing that I ever handled over there, unfortunately, was a helicopter crash. And the medical laboratory technicians at that time, we had to help the pathologists doing autopsies.
Ooh.
So anybody that got killed or in the service at that time, I think it was standard practice, had to have an autopsy to determine the cause of death. A report had to be written. And the person that I worked on, that they brought back in, was a helicopter. Either he was the pilot or the assistant pilot, the co-pilot rather. That was burnt rather badly in a helicopter crash. helicopter went down. I don't know if it was shot down or it was accidental, went down or what, but he was pretty badly burnt, and I had to remove the helmet from his head during the during the autopsy, and the top part of his skull came off inside the helmet, and that was pretty rough. But we got through it, and we did quite a few of those after that, different accidents and stuff like that. And of course, guys would come in and with malaria, and we do the blood work on them and find out that they've had malaria or something, or had symptoms of malaria, and draw their blood, and do the blood smears and find out that if they've had active malaria or not. And the best time to find out if somebody has malaria is when they're actually having chills and fever at the time. That's when the virus is most active. And we would wait until that period of time, then they would call us, and you could either do a simple finger stick or draw their blood and make smears. And we did that, and we were able to diagnose the type of malaria, and then the doctors could give them the proper treatment. And basically that's pretty much our experience, except we went to middle of the tour. Of course, they said you have R&R. We had at that time, they told us we could go anywhere. You could go, but you couldn't come back to the United States. You'd go to Hawaii. Most of the guys were going to either Australia or Japan. We picked Japan, which was a very expensive choice, and we had a great time. Went out to dinner and drank as much as we wanted, and did a lot of other things. The guys that went to Australia had the best time when they came back. I remember being in Japan, and I thought I brought ample money with me. I had to wire home for more money because everything was just so expensive. The guys that went to Australia, they said that they met people in the bars there. They didn't want them to stay in hotels. They wanted them to come back to their sheep farms and places like that and stay with them. And Aussies wouldn't let them spend any money on drinking. They paid for a lot of the stuff and got stuff for free. But it wasn't that way in Japan. There was a lot of rules and regulations too in Japan. You couldn't wear a uniform. We got there. We had to report to a base, and they brought us over to a place that looked like a J.C. Penney's or something, and turn in all your uniforms, and you had to get civilian clothes, and no uniforms were allowed. You couldn't. Of course, a lot of rules and regulations about where your unit is or where you're serving. You couldn't tell them you served in Vietnam or were serving in Vietnam. And of course, we were in Japan in January, and we had a tan, all of us. So the people, we walked into a bar, the girls in there, and they all knew that we were fresh from Vietnam. And it was no big secret, I don't think.
When you were working in the hospital, were you in charge of anything? Were you?
No, I was just a regular GI like everybody else. We had a sergeant that was in charge of the lab, and then a captain over him. And I don't know if you've ever been, you work in a medical lab. It's each guy has his own job. This guy's working in urine. This guy's working in blood work. Guy's working in the blood bank. This guy's doing microbiology, chemistry back there. And we all did, our job, and we rotated around and did different jobs like that.
Did you have a club or anything on the base? Or
No, we played cards a lot. Mm-hmm. It was a small, small base. Probably be a couple hundred bed hospital. We mainly did work to get people as well as we could to have them shipped out, and they would send them to, I think that was called the 409th General Hospital in Japan, so that they could be treated. They didn't, like now it's Rheinstein Air Force Base or in Germany, but at that time I think Japan was the closest place.
How did you stay in touch with your family during this time?
Letters, actually, it was letters. I made a couple of not videos, but cassette tapes for my mom. But mainly it was letters, and they didn't come in. They came in different sequences. You had to arrange them because sometimes the letters were ahead or back. You know, like I remember I got a letter from my fiance at the time, and she said her brother was engaged. Well, actually, he had already been married, and it was a couple of months back, you know, you know, and it was letters like that, you know. They were all came mixed up.
What was mail call like? How they run it?
Everybody looked forward to mail call, especially around, you know, like Christmas time and things like that, when you got goodie bags and, you know, stuff like that from home. You know, some of it had been gone through, but some of them made it to you all right, you know. But it was great. It was we really looked forward to that.
What kind of goodie bags did you get?
Cookies and stuff like that, and you know.
Did you have plenty of supplies?
Yeah,
in Vietnam?
we were
Any
pretty well
problems?
supplied. Except the food got pretty monotonous after a while. A lot of ham and a lot of powdered eggs and stuff like. No fresh milk. You know, the younger guys missed that, but as far as beer, we had plenty of beer. You know, they used to deliver the beer on a pallet, and we had some good shows. USO shows came in, and saw the Bob Hope show. You know how they do that, big production like that. They sent us all to Cameron Bay for that show, and it's pretty interesting.
Did you have a good luck charm, or was faith very important for you during that time?
Yeah, faith was very important at that time. I think a lot of us, either attended church or synagogue on a regular basis. And but as far as a good luck charm, no. But all the guys had what they call a short timers calendar, and we had a calendar that ran like 100 days or 200 days, whatever. And each day, or I would wait until I'd had a whole block, like a week or 2 weeks, and I'd block it out. And usually it was a naked woman, and you had to fill in all the little squares, you know.
What do you think of your fellow officers and soldiers during that time?
Being in medical corps, actually, I had officers. The enlisted guys, the older enlisted guys, were pretty fair. I got a funny story to tell you though. One of the officers who was in charge, it was one of the head doctors at the hospital I was at, an 85th Evacuation Hospital. His name was Dr. Gaitner, and probably about a year and a half after he came home before me, probably 6 months before I did. And then I came home to Connecticut, and they were starting this Yukon Medical Center. And we were in the old McCook Hospital, the city hospital before Yukon was built. We moved into the city hospital in downtown Hartford called McCook Hospital. And I was in line down there in the cafeteria, had just gotten a job, probably had been there like a month, and had my lab coat on, and I looked in front of me, and it was this taller guy than I was that had a lab coat on, and he turned around, it was Dr. Gaitner. And I thought that was I never even knew he was coming to Connecticut. I think he went to Johns Hopkins, and I thought he was going back to Johns Hopkins, and you know, we were like friends over there, and it was just amazing to see it. And we worked together for another 4 or 5 years there. And then he went on. I guess he's a big shot in Boston now.
Now, can you talk about leaving Vietnam?
Yeah, yeah. I think I went from Quin Yon by helicopter to Cameron Bay, and we waited at the airport, you know, for transport. And I think It was another civilian plane, you know, that came in, and like a TWA or whatever it was at that time, fly home, and yeah, turned in all our stuff, all weapons, and turned in all your old fatigues and stuff like that, put on a new khaki uniform and got on the plane and started heading home. But I can remember when the pilot announced that we're approaching the coast of California. We went to Fort Lewis in the state of Washington. That's where we landed. And I remember when the plane approached the coastline, there was a roar and a lot of guys clapping and cheering and stuff like that. And when we got off the plane, though, they did say that there were some protesters at the gate, but we never did get to see them. I never saw them. I was never approached by any protesters or anything like that. Of course, we had another physical there before we left, and then we got Army Greens uniform to come home in. Flew into Bradley Airfield from California, and a neighbor of I called my sister's house. She wasn't home, but I got a hold of a neighbor of hers, and they gave me a ride to my sister's house. They were at church at the time, and so no one was home. A neighbor saw me outside in front of the house, and he came over and he said, "Your sister they left for church." And so he gave me a ride to the church, and my sister and my brother-in-law and her kids were at church. I walked in church and sat with them. I saw where they were sitting. And of course, she was very happy to see me back home. So,
What a surprise.
yeah.
Now, were you finished with the Army then? Or were you?
I was all. We had to go. We had to do one more thing. We had to go. They told us we had to go to returning guys that were drafted for some reason. We had to go to Fort Drum summer camp for 2 weeks. I don't know why. I don't know if they just wanted to see if we were interested in getting back in the military. They didn't really have a job for us to do up there. We just mainly sat around and played cards most of the time. But we had to go up to Fort Drum and sit up there for a couple of weeks. And that was it. That was the end of my military duty.
What'd you do with the days and weeks after you were discharged?
Look for a job. Actually, I knew what I wanted to do. I know that was go back in the medical field again and pick up on my civilian life. And was probably only out of work probably a couple of weeks before I went back to work and landed that job at UConn Medical Center.
Did you use a GI Bill in any way?
Tried to. Actually, after I got married, went to Connecticut Bank and Trust. At that time, my wife and I, and I said, "Look, I got this GI Bill that says I could, buy a home." And Connecticut Bank and Trust said, "Nah, we're not. No help at all. They couldn't do anything." So I had to wait until we saved up enough money to put a down payment on a house. But no help at all.
The bank wasn't participating.
No, didn't offer anything. That was Connecticut Bank and Trust. Never did business with them after that either.
Did you maintain any friendships with people that you knew in the service?
Yeah, the four guys that I mentioned before, I was the first one in that group to get married, so they all came to my wedding. Matter of fact, the fourth guy to come home came home the weekend of my wedding. It was his first time home. That was this guy, Robert Del Oliver. And I think he taught history in Arizona. He came home, didn't have a suit to wear. I gave him one of my suits to wear at a wedding because I was wearing a tuxedo. And he came to the wedding, so, And then the three of them went on and traveled extensively through Europe. They wanted me to go, but I was, just newlywed at that time. There's no way I was going to go. But they went all through the Middle East. They traveled all through Europe. And on the way back, they all came over to my house on the way back and stayed with me for a couple of days before they traveled across the United States.
Did you join any veterans organizations after the military?
Yeah, VFW Avon is my group, and I also American Legion, and I'm also disabled American veteran. I lost a little bit of my hearing over there, so
How'd you lose that over there?
firing weapons. Yeah,
What kind of weapon did you carry there?
I had a 45 automatic shoulder holster, and I had M16. But we were actually trained as a recruit. M14 was very popular at that time.
Did your military experience and influences, did it change your thinking about war or the military in general?
It didn't change. Well, it's funny when I got over there, and the Vietnamese people that could speak English, some of them, we had Vietnamese civilians that worked on the base, at the hospital. And the ones that could speak English, you would talk to them and say, look, do you really want us here and helping you? And they said, look, it's either you, the French were here before you for 15 years. Our country has been at war for years and years, and, it doesn't really make any difference to us if you go or stay. Nothing's going to change, And that was kind of like the attitude I think that most of the people had. But I liked the military. I really did. If I probably thought about it more, I probably would have stayed in or joined the reserves, which I wish I did. I wish I would have joined the reserves, the National Guard.
You're also very active in the Horse Guard. Can you
I
tell
was.
me a little bit about
I was very active in the Horse Guard, actually.
why did you join the Horse Guard?
Well, like I said, I always did like the military. I liked the discipline in the military, and I liked the, I learned to be a man when I was in the Army. Learned to take care of myself, how to take care of your own clothing, and keep your place squared away and stuff like that. And, it teaches, I think, young men discipline, and I like that. And when I got out, I saw this group. It's called the First Company Governor's Horse Guard out in Avon, and I went up there actually with one of my buddies back in Connecticut here, high school friend of mine. His dad, his name was can't think of it. Gary Della Ripa. It was his son's name. John Della Ripa was the father. He said, my father rides a horse and he's up in Avon, and it's a military group. And I had ridden horses when I was a kid, and since I was 12 years old, at Keeney Park in Hartford. And we used to take a bus. I grew up in a project in Hartford, and we'd get on a bus and we'd go to Keeney Park and ride horses. And so Gary said to me, Andy, you still riding horses? I said, yeah. He says, actually, I rent a horse. He says, well, my dad belongs to this group out in Avon. Why don't you go up there and take a look at it? It's called the Governor's Horse Guard. So his father picked me up one night, and we went out there, and I liked it. I thought it was a great group. I had a lot of World War II guys who were in there, and some guys from Korea. And they were very military. It was all men at that time. There was no women in the group. And it was good. I mean, it was a recruit class and everything, and it was not soft. It was pretty tough in those times. We lived in they had a small little shack on a hill that they called the EM room, enlisted man's room, and it was an old photo shack from Bradley Airfield that they let them use. But we had a string of horses, probably about 40 horses, an old barn, and went through recruit class, became a PFC, and spent a lot of time in the riding platoon as a private. And I got out for a bit. I was probably in for like 8 years. Then I got out for about 1.5 years or 2 years. My kids were starting to grow up in soccer and baseball and everything like that, and I got busy with that. But then I got back in right after that as a private, and really got in. We used to do gymkhanas and horse shows and working at horse shows and parades and, you know, musical rides and stuff like that, and traveled around a lot. And as you know, in the horse guard or in a military group, every once in a while we had to go to Washington. And when we went to Washington, some of the guys would say, well, let's go see the Vietnam Memorial. Well, I don't know if you've ever been there, but at the Vietnam Memorial, the bus pulls up. We got off the bus and you go into like a little park, and there's some statues, and then the park kind of sinks down into the ground. And give me a minute. There's a part where it sinks down in the ground, and as you walk along, you start to see all the names. And I often wondered how many names of those guys. I might have held their hand or assisted them before they died. And that kind of bothered me.
Yeah, it's tough. No, I've seen the wall too, but I never had the contact you had with the wall or the people.
Yep. So that was
Is there? We're almost.
always
finished.
gave me an airy feeling, that place. For some reason, it just
It's,
every time I went there, it always overtook me. Could never get used to it, so I don't bother going anymore.
well, now they have the Korean.
I never
Right.
seen the Korean one.
That's really
Yeah.
different also.
Yeah, I never seen the Korean one. It's just the way that's situated, where you go underground and you start seeing all the names, and it's just a very eerie feeling when you go there.
We're almost finished with this interview. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Your thoughts about this very important part of your life?
Yeah, it is an important part of my life, but I think in any type of situation, may it be Afghanistan or Iraq or something like that, if you're a young man and you can't let it overtake your life. You have to go on and realize that once you come home, if you're going to remain as a civilian, you know, at home, you have to kind of like, well, that was a part of your life, and you have to let it go. Unfortunately, some of the Vietnam guys and Korean guys in World War II were never had that peace. I always felt bad that the country too never really recognized Vietnam, never welcomed us back home, and I always felt bad about that. Put an end to it, and that's probably why some Vietnam guys and some Korean guys probably have a tough time with it. didn't get the recognition.
Yeah, well, thank you, Andy, for this very important interview and sharing part of your life. Thank you.
Thanks.